Hi, this is Mrs. Kidman, and in this video, we're going to be discussing how we can solve quadratic equations by completing the square. So what do we mean when we say completing the square? Well, what we're looking at is I have an equation of the form x squared plus bx. Okay, so I've got here this wonderful little x squared. Here's my square, and it's an x by x. And then I've got this rectangle here that is bx. So it's a b by the length of x. Now, if I want to make this into a square and I move those together, what ends up happening is as I move this piece right here closer, well, it will end up getting our little rectangle here. Actually ends up getting, do you see how it like overlaps there? But we just create a bigger rectangle. That's not helpful when it comes to creating a square. So what we are talking about here is instead of doing that, what I want to do is I want to divide this piece in half and take half of it and put it down here. So then I have half of b right here. I've got the other half of b of x right there. And so I only have half of the b length. So this is still x and x. But now I have half of b. And by dividing that space between those two, if I find this little spot here, I can make a whole square. Now, what is that spot? Well, this is still half of b, and this is still half of b. So our little special spot here that we need to add to complete that square is going to be half of b squared. And by completing that square, what we end up getting is we end up being able to write this in a factored form of x plus half of b squared. Okay, and we want to rewrite it this way because remember in class yesterday how we solved problems that were like x plus 1 squared equals 36. If we can rewrite a quadratic in this form right here, then all of a sudden I can just use that square root method to solve the quadratic. And that is going to be way easier than trying to find a factor or trying to do some other method that we haven't talked about yet. So we want to complete the square so that we can solve for x. So let's take a look at, again, our steps when we solve for x. So what we're first going to do is step one, we want to identify b. So figure out what that is. B is always going to be the one attached to our x. Step two is we want to divide it by 2 and figure out that equals. Step three is we want to square our b value. And that'll give us our new value. And then what we want to do after that is we actually want to add that b over 2 squared to our x squared plus bx. Okay, so we want to include that there. So we end up with x squared plus bx plus half of b squared. And then the last step is we want to factor it. And by factoring it, what we end up getting is x plus b over 2 or half of b squared. And by factoring it, we can use our square root method to then solve for x. So let's just practice completing the square here. So again, our steps for completing the square is we want to identify b. So in this case, b is 6. Our second step is to divide it by 2. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. Step 3 is to take that value and square it. So 3 squared is 9. So to complete the square here, what we're going to do is step 4 means that I need to add 9 to this equation up here. So here we go. Added 9 to my expression. Fantastic. And then step 5 is to factor. And so as we factor it, remember it's going to be in the form x plus half of b squared. So this one becomes x plus what's half of b? 6 squared. Fantastic. Now let's do the same thing with part b here. So we need to identify b, which is negative 9. And then we need to divide it by 2. Notice how when b is odd, it makes this problem a lot harder because all of a sudden we're dealing with fractions or decimals. Then once we get that value, so we had negative 9/2 or negative 4.5, we need to square it. And by squaring it, when we have negative 4.5 squared, what we end up getting is negative, or squaring it, sorry, it's going to be positive. We end up getting 20.25. And then the last thing that we need to do is we want to add that to our problem. So here we go, adding it, 20.25. And then step 5 is to factor. So when we factor this, we end up getting x plus b divided by 2 squared. So this is going to be x Our b divided by 2 is negative, so x minus 4.5 squared. Fantastic. So then why is this important when it comes to solving? Well, what we're going to do is we are going to look at it this way. So we've got x squared minus 16x, and I'm going to rewrite it with this blank because I've got to complete my square here. So plus whatever number we complete our square with equals negative 15. And because this is an equation, whatever I add on one side, I have to add to the other, okay, to keep it consistent, to keep it equal. So now let's follow through our steps. So step 1 is to identify our b, which is negative 16. Step 2 is to divide that by 2, which is negative 8. Step 3 is to square that value, which gives us a 64. Step 4 is to add it in. So I'm going to add my 64 up here, and whatever I do on one side, I have to do on the other. And then I want to factor it. So I'm going to factor here. And as I factor it, I end up getting x plus my b divided by 2, which is negative 8 squared equals, and then I can actually combine these and I get 49. Now notice how we now have two squares. So with two squares, I can use that square root method to divide both of these, and I end up getting x minus 8 equals 7, as well as x minus 8 equals negative 7. And remember, that's because 7 squared is 49 and negative 7 squared is 49. So then we end up getting our x values, which is x equals 15 and x equals 1. Fantastic. So this is what we're going to do to complete the square. Notice how we were able to factor out this problem or solve it by completing the square. Now, this problem here, we could have added it over to the other side and gotten x squared minus 16x plus 15 equals 0, and then we could have used our x method to factor it. Great, that option does work, but when it comes to completing the square, this one is really helpful because it works at times when our x method won't work. So let's take a look at this next example here. We can't factor this one, right? There is no way for me to multiply two numbers to get 3 and add them to get 12. That's just not going to happen. So what we want to do here is we're going to complete the square to solve this one. So I've got my x squared plus 12x plus 3 equals 0. Now when we complete the square, I want x squared plus bx plus the number that I create equals whatever our c value is plus that number that I create, the negative version of our c value. So what I want to do is I need to move this 3 to the other side because I only want my x's on this side. So I'm going to move it to the other side, and I end up getting x squared plus 12x plus some number. That's what we need to complete our square, equals negative 3 plus that number that we used to complete our square. Now to complete our square, remember we're going to follow through our steps. So b is 12, which means that half of b is going to be 6. And squaring our half of b is going to be 36. So then step 4, remember, is we want to add that 36 to both sides. And then step 5 is we want to factor it. So as we factor this here, we end up getting x plus 6 equals, well, negative 3 plus 36 is 33. So x plus 6 squared equals 33. Well, I can square root this side, and I can actually square root this side as well. The square root of 33 is a number. Now, it is not rational. It's going to have a lot of decimal places. So what we're going to do in this case is we're going to round to the nearest hundredth or 2 decimal places out to look at this problem. So I end up getting x plus 6 equals, and the square root of 33 is going to be 5.74. And then we also get the negative version of that because remember that square root can be either the positive square or the negative square. So negative 5.74. And then we want to solve for x. So as we solve for x here, I get 5.74 minus 6, which is negative 0.26. And on this side, I get negative 5.74 minus 6, which gives me a negative 11.74. So here are those two solutions. And that's how we can use that completing the square method to solve these. Notice how this one could not be solved by factoring. Immediately, it couldn't have been solved by our square roots, but by completing the square, we can use our square root method to solve it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and do these two problems, and we are going to work through them on our own and then come back and double check. So let's go ahead and start here with this first one. So what I want you to do is follow through all of our steps that we've been going through. So move all of the constants from the left side to the right side, then complete the square, then square root both sides and solve for x. When you've finished following through those steps, unpause the video and we will go over the problem together. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to finish going over this first one. Now, our first one, the very first thing we want to do is move all of our constants to the other side. So what we did here is we added 3 to both sides to get that 3 on the other side. And I ended up with x squared plus 8x plus some number I need to complete my square equals 3 plus whatever that number is. So then to complete the square, we follow through our 5 steps. So our step number 1 is to identify b, which was 8. Step number 2 is to divide b by 2, which means that we have b divided by 2, which is 4. Step number 3 is to square that number. So 4 squared is 16. Step number 4 is to add that number into our x squared plus bx. So now I have x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 3 plus 16. Remember, if I add 16 to one side, I have to add it to the other. Now that it's on both sides, what I want to do is factor out the left side. So instead of x squared plus 8x plus 16, I'm going to write it as x plus 4 squared. Now that we have this x plus 4 squared, what we're going to do is set that equal to 3 plus 16, which is 19. Now, the x plus 4 is squared, so we want to get rid of that squared. The way we're going to do that is square root it. So by square rooting both sides, we end up getting x plus 4 equals the square root of 19, which is both positive and negative, about 4.36. Now, as we solve for x there, we end up getting that x is roughly 0.36 and negative 8.36. So that is kind of how we solve by completing the square. Let's try one more example here. Now, this one, notice, has an odd value in the middle. Now, when our middle value is odd, we want to make sure that we are being aware that this is going to actually end up having some fractions in it. So let's go ahead and work through this problem all together. Whoop, that was fun. Work through this problem all together. I want you to try it on your own first, and then we'll work through it together. So go ahead and write down on a piece of paper what you think the solutions would be. Solve for x by completing the square. When you finish, unpause the video, and we'll go over it together. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to go over that second one. So again, remember, we want to move that constant or that negative 3 to the other side. So we're going to add it to both sides, add 3 to both sides, and we end up getting x squared minus 9x plus that number we need to complete the square equals 3 plus that number we need to complete the square. So then we need to find that number. Remember, to find that number, we're going to follow our 5 steps there. So first we need to identify b, which was negative 9, then divide it by 2, which gives us a negative 4.5 or a negative 9/2. And then we take that number and we square it. And when we square negative 4.5, we end up getting 20.25 or 20.25. And then that we want to add that 20.25 to either side. So as we do that, what happens is on the left-hand side of our equation, we can factor it, and we end up getting x minus 4.5 squared equals our 3 plus 20.25, which ends up giving us a 23.25. And then we want to solve for x. So to get rid of that squared on the left-hand side, we need to square root both sides of our equation. And as we square root both sides of our equation, we end up getting x minus 4.5 equals 4.82. And x minus 4.5 equals negative 4.82. Again, this is the rounded version of the square root of 23.25. But we rounded it to 200ths place, so this should be accurate enough. And then we want to solve for x by adding 4.5 to both sides. And we end up getting x is 9.32, as well as x equals a negative 0.32. So that is how we're going to solve by completing the square. The biggest thing to remember or to notice here is that we only want to use this completing the square method if there is no number in front of our x squared. If there's a number in front of our x squared, we are going to want to use one of our other methods because completing the square gets more complicated when there's a number up there, and we just don't want to deal with that. So remember to follow these 5 steps when you're completing the square there, and remember to make sure that that front number is a 1. If our middle value is even, it makes it a lot easier, but we can do it with odd, as you can see. So solving quadratics by completing the square is a great way to overcome that idea that we might not be able to factor it. And feel free to check out our next video when we're going to cover how we can use the quadratic formula to solve quadratics.